La Jamais Contente looked like a vehicle that someone had fired from the future straight into the middle of the 19th century. In an era when most automobiles still resembled horse-drawn carriages with an engine attached, this machine had a torpedo-shaped body, electric drive, and one goal: to break a speed barrier that many considered almost inhuman, 100 kilometers per hour. Today, such a figure does not impress even the driver of a city car, but in 1899, it was shocking. People were only just getting used to the idea that a vehicle without a horse could move along the road by itself, and Camille Janazzi wanted to prove that it could go faster than anything built before. Most interestingly, he did it not with an internal combustion car, but with an electric one. La Jamais Contente was therefore not only a record-breaking vehicle, but also a symbol of an alternative history of motoring, a world in which electricity, for a moment, seemed like the natural path of automotive development. This machine had no comfort, no practicality, and no great range. It was built as a tool for one task: to accelerate on a straight stretch of road in a chair near Paris and write the name of its creator into history. And that is exactly why it remains an icon to this day. Not because it was perfect, but because it was first. The first to break the magical barrier of 100 kilometers per hour and show that the automobile could become a machine of speed. The history of La Jamais Contente begins in times when the future of motoring was not obvious at all. At the end of the 19th century, three technologies were competing with one another on roads and in workshops: steam, gasoline, and electricity. Today we view automotive history through the lens of the victory of the internal combustion engine. But back then, nothing was decided. Electric cars had many advantages. They were quieter, cleaner, simpler to operate, and often easier to drive than primitive combustion vehicles. In cities, especially in Paris, people were even thinking about electric fiacres and taxis that could replace horse-drawn carriages. Camille Janazzi, a Belgian electrical engineer, understood the potential of such propulsion perfectly. He came from a family connected with the rubber industry, and after his father's death, he ran a company producing rubber goods and tires. He was a man of technology, but also a man of ambition. In 1898, he founded a company in France dealing with electric utility vehicles. He wanted to build his own cars and win contracts. And in those days, the best advertisement was not a marketing campaign, but a speed record. If your machine was the fastest, the world talked about it. If the world talked about it, customers began to believe in your technology. That is why the fight for the record was not just a sporting game. It was a war for prestige, for the future of propulsion, and for position in the emerging automotive market. Janazzi's main rival was the French aristocrat Gaston de Chasseloup-Laubat, associated with the Jonteau brand. It was he who was one of the first to enter the history of automobile speed records. In December 1898 in Achères, on a section prepared by the circle around the magazine La France Automobile, he reached more than 63 kilometers per hour. Today it sounds modest, but at the time it was an impressive result. Janazzi, however, had no intention of giving way. In January 1899, he answered with a result of more than 66 kilometers per hour, but Chasseloup-Laubat improved the record that same day to more than 70 kilometers per hour. The rivalry began to gain momentum. A few days later, Janazzi achieved more than 80 kilometers per hour, and in March, his French opponent, using a better streamlined Jontaud vehicle, raised the result to more than 92 kilometers per hour. It was a true war for the record, described by the press with enormous emotion. Both competitors understood that the next symbolic barrier would be 100 kilometers per hour. For society at the time, that number had an almost magical meaning. Many people believed that the human body might not withstand such speed, that the air would press too strongly against the body, and that the vehicle would become impossible to control. Janazzi therefore decided to build something completely new. Not another electric carriage, but the first true car created exclusively with a speed record in mind. Thus, La Jamais Contente was born, meaning the never satisfied, or never content. The name itself remains slightly mysterious to this day. Some claim that it referred to the character of Camille Janazzi, a man who was never satisfied with the result he had achieved and always wanted to go faster. Others suggest that it was a joking reference to his wife. Regardless of its origin, the name suited the project perfectly. Janazzi really was not satisfied with the existing records. He wanted a breakthrough. That is why his new vehicle received a body unlike anything that had previously appeared on roads. Instead of a tall, angular carriage, an aerodynamic form resembling a projectile, torpedo, or cigar was used. The body was made from a light metal alloy known as partinium, containing, among other elements, aluminum, tungsten, and magnesium. This was a very modern solution for the end of the 19th century. The body was meant to reduce air resistance, which at higher and higher speeds became a huge opponent. It must be added, however, that the aerodynamics of La Jamais Contente were far from perfect. The driver sat high, protruding above the body, and chassis components were visible underneath. This spoiled the effect of the streamlined shape. Even so, the idea itself was groundbreaking. Janazzi was one of the first to understand that speed depends not only on engine power, but also on how a vehicle cuts through the air. In this sense, La Jamais Contente was the great-grandmother of all later record cars. The technical data of La Jamais Contente shows how unusual this construction was for its time. The vehicle was about 3 meters and 80 centimeters long, about 1.5 meters wide, and weighed roughly 1,450 kilograms, although some sources give figures closer to 1,100 kilograms in running order. The differences result from different ways of calculating weight and equipment, but one thing is certain: an enormous part of the mass consisted of batteries. These were lead-acid batteries made by Fullman, very heavy, but capable of delivering a high current for a short time. Propulsion was provided by 2 Postel-Vinet electric motors, each with a power of about 25 kilowatts. Together, this gave about 50 kilowatts, or roughly 68 horsepower. The motors operated at a voltage of about 200 volts and drove the rear wheels. For a car from 1899, this was enormous power. La Jamais Contente also used Michelin pneumatic tires, which was very important, because in that era, many vehicles still ran on hard rims or solid rubber. Air-filled tires improved contact with the road and made it safer to reach higher speeds. Interestingly, the vehicle did not have brakes in the modern sense. To stop, it used reversal of the motor's operation, a primitive form of electric braking. It was an extreme, simplified construction subordinated to the record. Comfort had no meaning, only speed mattered. The most important day in the history of La Jamais Contente came on the 29th of April 1899 on the road in Achères near Paris. It was there that, for several months, successive attempts at speed records had taken place, attracting crowds of spectators, journalists, and enthusiasts of the new technology. To a modern person, such a scene might seem modest. There were no grandstands, no television, and no sponsors investing millions of dollars. But there was fascination with something completely new. The automobile was a fresh, mysterious invention, arousing emotions comparable to those that space flights would provoke 100 years later. Camille Janazzi knew perfectly well that on that day he could enter history. An earlier attempt had failed because of organizational problems connected with marking out the measured section. This time, everything was prepared correctly. The Belgian took his place at the controls of his extraordinary machine and then set off toward the measured section. When La Jamais Contente flashed through the timing line, the timekeepers recorded a result that immediately caused a sensation. The average speed over the flying kilometer was 105.882 thousandths kilometers per hour. For the first time in history, a human being in a road vehicle had crossed the barrier of 100 kilometers per hour. Today it seems symbolic, But then it was a moment comparable to the first breaking of the sound barrier by an aircraft. Jamais not only beat his rival's record, but also accomplished something that only a few years earlier had seemed impossible. The significance of this record is difficult to overestimate. At the end of the 19th century, average mechanical vehicles moved at speeds from a dozen to at most several dozen kilometers per hour. Most people traveled by train, carriage, or on foot. Breaking the barrier of 100 kilometers per hour provoked almost scientific discussions. Some doctors and publicists claimed that the human body might not withstand such a load. People feared breathing problems, loss of consciousness, and even death caused by the enormous force of air. Today these theories sound amusing, but they show how revolutionary Janatsi's achievement was. When La Jamais Contente exceeded 100 kilometers per hour, many observers understood that the possibilities of the automobile were much greater than previously assumed. It was also a breakthrough moment for the very idea of motorsport. Competition for records stopped being a technical curiosity and began to become a spectacle. Equally important, the success was achieved by an electric vehicle. At a time when the world had not yet definitively chosen internal combustion, the triumph of La Jamais Contente was proof that electricity had enormous potential. For the next few years, many observers were convinced that cars powered by current would dominate the future. History took a different course, but in the spring of 1899, electric cars stood at the very top of the technological race. Camille Janatsi himself was a figure almost made for such achievements. He was called the Red Devil, mainly because of his distinctive red beard, but also because of his extraordinarily daring driving style. He was not only a driver, but also a constructor, entrepreneur, and visionary. Unlike many later record breakers, he did not sit behind the wheel of a machine prepared by a staff of engineers. He co-created his vehicles, developed the technology, and risked his own life during attempts. Janatsi believed in electric propulsion with almost religious conviction. His company produced electric utility vehicles and taxis intended for Paris. The record was meant to be not only a sporting triumph, but also a commercial argument. Showing the world that an electric car could be the fastest vehicle on Earth was supposed to increase customer interest in his products. Fate, however, can be ironic. Although Janatsi achieved success, he did not build a great automotive empire. His company produced only a small number of vehicles, and the market increasingly moved toward gasoline engines. Even so, the Belgian himself remained active in motorsport. In 1903, he won the prestigious Gordon Bennett Cup behind the wheel of a Mercedes, proving that he could also succeed in the era of developing combustion constructions. His life, however, ended tragically. In December 1913, he died during a hunt, hit by an accidental shot. He was only 45 years old. Although the record of La Jamais Contente was a great success, paradoxically, it did not save electric motoring. In the first years of the 20th century, electric cars began to lose against combustion designs. There were several reasons. The most important remained battery technology. Lead-acid batteries were heavy, had limited capacity, and required long charging times. While over a short distance they could deliver impressive power, in everyday use, they became a serious limitation. The record-breaking vehicle itself had a range measured at only a few or several dozen kilometers, depending on how it was used. Meanwhile, the development of the oil industry and the discovery of new oil deposits made fuel increasingly accessible. In addition, internal combustion engines were constantly being improved. Soon, better carburetors, more reliable ignition systems, and a developed fuel infrastructure appeared. The final blow to electromobility was delivered by mass production. When Henry Ford launched production of the Model T, gasoline cars became available to a broad group of customers. Electric cars could not compete either in price or in range. As a result, the technology that in 1899 had set the most important speed record in the world was pushed to the margins for more than 100 years. That is exactly why the history of La Jamais Contente is so fascinating. It shows that technological development does not always follow the path of the most advanced solutions. Looking today at the construction of La Jamais Contente, it is easy to notice elements that were ahead of their time. The car was one of the first examples of conscious use of aerodynamics in motoring. At a time when most manufacturers were simply copying the form of horse-drawn carriages, Jamais tried to understand the influence of air resistance on performance. The use of light metal alloys was also a very modern solution. Today, aluminum, magnesium, and advanced composite materials are standard in supercars and record vehicles. At the end of the 19th century, however, they represented true technological avant-garde. The direct electric drive of the wheels can also be regarded as an extremely innovative solution. What is more, La Jamais Contente was probably the first car designed exclusively to break a speed record. Earlier record vehicles were usually modified versions of existing constructions. Jamais, however, created a machine subordinated to one task. That is why many historians consider it the first true world record car built from scratch. In a sense, it was the ancestor of all later legends, from Malcolm Campbell's Bluebird to jet-powered monsters such as Thrust SSC. Each of these vehicles pursued the same idea: to create a machine not for everyday driving, but for pushing the limits of human capability. In the years following the record, La Jamais Contente became a symbol of technological courage, but its record was not eternal. Motoring developed at a dizzying pace, and manufacturers of steam, electric, and combustion cars constantly looked for ways to increase the performance of their constructions. Janassi's record lasted for more than 3 years, which in that era was a very long time. It was not until the 13th of April, 1902, that it was beaten by Léon Serpollet, who, behind the wheel of a steam vehicle called the Gardner Serpollet Oeuf de Pack, reached a speed of 120.8 kilometers per hour. Interestingly, that car also had a very streamlined body, resembling an egg or a projectile. This meant that constructors were beginning to understand the importance of aerodynamics. Serpollet's success, however, did not diminish Janassi's achievement. It was La Jamais Contente that first broke the psychological barrier of 100 kilometers per hour. Just as the first human ascent of Mount Everest remains more important than later faster ascents, Janassi's record retained a unique place in history. It is also worth remembering that it was a record set by an electric car. For the next decades, successive speed records belonged almost exclusively to combustion vehicles, and later also to jet and rocket vehicles. In a sense, La Jamais Contente therefore remained the last great symbol of an era in which electromobility had a real chance to dominate the world of motoring. For most of the 20th century, La Jamais Contente was remembered mainly by historians of technology and enthusiasts of speed records. The world marveled at increasingly faster combustion cars, gigantic aircraft engines mounted in record vehicles, and later jet constructions. Meanwhile, the pioneering electric car from 1899 seemed merely a curiosity from a distant past. Only toward the end of the 20th century did interest in it begin to grow again. In 1993, thanks to the initiative of French enthusiasts and students of the University of Technology of Compiègne, a faithful replica of the vehicle was created. The project required enormous research work because many elements had to be recreated in accordance with historical documentation. Michelin prepared the appropriate tires, specialists recreated the bodywork, and engineers took care of the drivetrain. As a result, a working example was built, allowing modern people to see what one of the most important machines in the history of motoring looked like and how it functioned. The original La Jamais Contente, meanwhile, is located in the French Automobile Museum in Compiègne. It is one of the most valuable exhibits of that institution and regularly attracts visitors from all over the world. For many people, it is not only a technical monument, but also a symbol of an unfulfilled vision of a world in which electric cars could have dominated from the beginning of the 20th century. So the question arises, How much could La Jamais Contente be worth today? The answer is not simple, because such a vehicle is practically priceless. On the collector market, there are cars from the beginning of the 20th century that reach prices counted in millions of dollars. Exceptional examples of brands such as Mercedes, Rolls-Royce, or Bugatti can cost from several to even several dozen $million. However, La Jamais Contente is in an entirely different category. It is not just an old car. It is the first road vehicle to exceed 100 kilometers per hour. It is one of the most important monuments in the history of world motoring, and one of the most important electric vehicles ever built. If it hypothetically appeared on the open auction market, its value could easily exceed several dozen $million. Many experts believe that the price could even reach a level comparable with the most expensive cars ever sold at auction. In practice, however, such a scenario is almost impossible. The vehicle has historical significance that goes beyond ordinary collector value. For France, Belgium, and the entire history of motoring, it is a cultural asset of museum importance. That is why its true value cannot be expressed only in money. It is part of the technical heritage of the world. Looking from the perspective of the 21st century, it is difficult not to notice the irony of history. An electric car set one of the most important records of the turn of the century, and then for more than 100 years, the world almost forgot about this technology. Only the modern revolution of electromobility made the name of Camille Janotzi and the name La Jamais Contente begin appearing again in articles, museums, and publications devoted to the history of transport. Today's electric hypercars have power exceeding 1,000 horsepower and reach more than 400 kilometers per hour. Even so, all of them are in a sense descendants of the torpedo-shaped vehicle from 1899. It was Janotzi who showed the world that electric propulsion could be synonymous with performance, not merely quiet movement around the city. When modern manufacturers boast about the lightning-fast acceleration of their cars, it is worth remembering that the roots of this idea reach back to the end of the 19th century. La Jamais Contente was proof that from the very beginning, electricity could deliver impressive power and emotion. Its history reminds us that technological development does not always proceed in a straight line. Sometimes solutions considered outdated return after many decades and change the world again. So why is La Jamais Contente an icon of motoring? Because it was something far more than just a record-breaking car. It was the first vehicle created exclusively to push the limits of speed. It was a pioneer of aerodynamics, lightweight construction materials, and high-performance electric propulsion. It was a symbol of the age of great inventors who designed, built, and drove their machines with their own hands. Above all, however, it was the first car to prove that the barrier of 100 kilometers per hour was not the end of human possibilities. In a world full of modern supercars, computers, and advanced electronics, it is easy to forget how extraordinary that moment was. On the 29th of April, 1899, Camille Janotzi sat high above the streamlined body of his electric torpedo and drove straight into history. Thanks to this, La Jamais Contente remains not only one of the most important electric cars of all time, but also one of the most important cars in the history of motoring as a whole. Its record was the beginning of the endless race for speed that continues to this day.